The grand ballroom of the Riverside Hotel was filled with the most powerful people in the city. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, sending little rainbows dancing across the marble floors. Women in expensive gowns walked beside men in perfectly fitted suits. The sound of soft classical music floated through the air as waiters moved silently between the guests, carrying in trays of champagne and tiny appetizers. This was the annual charity gala organized by Richard Harrington, one of the wealthiest men in the country. At 62 years old, Richard had built an empire from nothing. He owned hotels, restaurants, and shopping centers across 3 continents. But tonight was not about business. Tonight was about raising money for children who could not afford music education. The irony of this cause was known only to Richard himself, and it was a secret he had carried for over 30 years. Richard stood near the center of the room, shaking hands and accepting compliments from his guests. His silver hair was neatly combed back, and his dark blue eyes still held the sharpness of a man who had fought his way to the top. He smiled politely as a senator told him about a recent golf trip, but his mind was somewhere else entirely. He kept looking toward the service door where the waiters came and went. There was something about one of the waitresses that had caught his attention the moment he walked into the ballroom. She was young, perhaps in her late 20s, with long dark hair tied back in a simple ponytail. She wore the same black and white uniform as the other servers, but there was something different about her. Something in the way she moved, the way she held herself, reminded him of someone he had known a very long time ago. The young woman carried her tray with grace and precision. She never spilled a drop, never bumped into another server, never seemed flustered by the demanding guests. Richard watched as she approached a table of wealthy businessmen who were being particularly rude, snapping their fingers and making comments about her appearance. She simply smiled, served them their drinks, and walked away with her head held high. There was dignity in her silence, strength in her calm. Richard excused himself from the senator and began to walk slowly around the room, keeping the young waitress in his sight. He noticed that she had a small scar on her left hand, running from her thumb to her wrist. It was the kind of scar that came from a serious injury, perhaps from many years ago. He also noticed that whenever she passed the grand piano that sat in the corner of the ballroom, her eyes would linger on it for just a moment longer than necessary. The piano was a beautiful instrument, a vintage Steinway that Richard had purchased specifically for events like this. Later in the evening, a famous concert pianist would perform for the guests. But for now, it sat empty and waiting, its black surface gleaming under the lights. Richard made his way to the bar and ordered a whiskey. He stood there, pretending to watch the crowd, but his eyes kept returning to the young waitress. Who was she? Why did she seem so familiar? And why did his heart feel heavy whenever he looked at her face? His assistant, a nervous young man named Thomas, appeared at his side. Thomas was always worried about something, and tonight was no exception. He informed Richard that the pianist who was supposed to perform had called with bad news. His flight had been delayed because of a storm, and he would not arrive for at least another 3 hours. The guests were expecting entertainment, and there was no backup plan. Richard listened to this news with a strange calmness. Normally he would have been furious at such a disruption, but tonight he simply nodded and told Thomas not to worry. He would handle it. Thomas looked confused but did not argue. He had learned long ago that Richard Harrington always had a plan. The evening continued, and the guests began to grow restless. They had eaten the expensive food and drunk the expensive wine. Now they wanted to be entertained. Richard could hear them whispering, wondering when the music would begin. Some of them were already checking their watches and thinking about leaving. Richard walked over to the grand piano and stood beside it. He ran his fingers along the smooth wood, remembering a time when he used to play this very type of instrument. That was before the money, before the success, before he had become the man everyone saw today. In those days he had been poor, hungry, and desperately in love with a woman who had a voice like an angel and a daughter who had just learned to walk. He pushed those memories aside. They were too painful, too raw, even after all these years. He had made choices, terrible choices, and he had spent his entire life trying to make up for them. That was why he organized this charity every year. That was why he gave millions to music education programs. He was trying to pay a debt that could never truly be repaid. The young waitress walked past him, carrying an empty tray back to the kitchen. Without thinking, Richard reached out and touched her arm. She stopped and looked at him, her dark eyes meeting his. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Richard felt as if he was looking into the face of someone he had once known better than anyone in the world. He asked her name. She told him it was Maria, just Maria, no last name, no explanation. Her voice was soft but firm, and there was a guardedness in her expression that suggested she was used to protecting herself from curious strangers. Richard nodded slowly. He told her that he had noticed something about her, something that set her apart from the other servers. He had seen the way she looked at the piano. Did she play? Maria's expression changed for just a fraction of a second. A flash of something crossed her face, but it was gone before Richard could identify it. She told him that she used to play a long time ago, but not anymore. Then she excused herself and walked toward the kitchen. Richard watched her go, his mind racing. There was a story there, he was certain of it. A story of loss, perhaps, or disappointment. He had seen that same look in his own mirror for the past 3 decades. Whatever had happened to this young woman, it had taken something precious from her. And standing there in the middle of his own extravagant party, surrounded by people who only cared about money and status, Richard Harrington made a decision. Before the night was over, he was going to find out the truth about Maria. The applause continued for what seemed like forever. Maria stood beside the piano, overwhelmed by the response, not knowing what to do with her hands or where to look. She had never experienced anything like this before. Even during her days as a young performer, she had never received such genuine, heartfelt appreciation. Richard climbed onto the stage and took her hand, raising it high like a boxing referee announcing a champion. The guests cheered even louder. Cameras flashed as people took photos with their phones, capturing the moment that was already being described as the highlight of the evening. The wealthy donors who had been ready to leave early were now crowding toward the stage, wanting to know more about this mysterious waitress with the golden touch, but Maria barely noticed them. Her attention was fixed on Richard, who was looking at her with an expression she could not understand. It was more than admiration, it was more than surprise. There was recognition in his eyes, as if he was seeing something that only he could see, and beneath that recognition there was pain. Deep, old pain that matched the pain Maria had been carrying all her life. Richard led her off the stage and through a side door, away from the crowd. Maria followed without question, too dazed to protest. They entered a small private office, elegantly furnished with leather chairs and dark wood paneling. Richard closed the door, and suddenly the noise of the gala was muted, like a distant dream. He asked her to sit down. Maria sank into one of the leather chairs, her legs finally giving way to the exhaustion and emotion of what had just happened. Richard poured 2 glasses of water from a crystal decanter and handed one to her. His hands, she noticed, were shaking slightly. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Richard paced back and forth in front of the window, running his hand through his silver hair. He seemed to be struggling with something, fighting an internal battle that Maria could not see. Finally, he stopped and turned to face her. He told her that he needed to ask her something. He said it was very important, and he needed her to answer honestly. Maria nodded, confused and a little frightened by the intensity in his voice. Richard asked about her mother. He asked what her mother's name was, where she had grown up, what she had done for work before Maria was born. The questions caught Maria off guard. Why would this wealthy stranger care about her mother? But something in his voice made her answer. She told him that her mother's name was Elena Vasquez. She had grown up in a small town in the mountains, far from the city. She had been a singer when she was young, performing at local festivals and weddings, before life became too difficult and she had to give it up. With each word Maria spoke, Richard's face grew paler. He gripped the back of a chair as if he might fall without its support. His eyes had become wet, and his breathing was shallow and rapid. Maria stopped talking, alarmed by his reaction. She asked if he was okay, if she should call someone, if he needed help. But Richard shook his head. He told her he was fine, that he just needed a moment. He sat down heavily in the chair across from her and put his face in his hands. When he looked up again, there were tears streaming down his cheeks for the second time that night. He spoke slowly, carefully, as if each word was costing him tremendous effort. 32 years ago, he said, he had been a different man. He had been young, poor, struggling to survive in a world that seemed determined to crush him. He had worked as a musician, playing piano in bars and restaurants for tips, dreaming of a better life. And he had fallen in love with a woman who had the most beautiful voice he had ever heard. Her name was Elena. Maria felt the room spin around her. She gripped the arms of her chair, trying to anchor herself to reality. This could not be happening. This could not be true. Richard continued, his voice breaking. He and Elena had been together for 2 years. They had been happy, despite their poverty. They had talked about marriage, about having children, about building a life together. And then Elena had told him she was pregnant. He paused, unable to continue. Maria sat frozen, her mind refusing to process what she was hearing. Finally, Richard forced himself to go on. He said that he had been young and foolish and terrified. He had just been offered an opportunity, a chance to work for a wealthy businessman who saw potential in him. But the job required him to move away, to travel constantly, to dedicate himself completely to his career. There was no room for a wife and child. He had made a choice, the worst choice of his life. He had taken the job and left Elena behind. He had told himself that he would send money, that he would come back someday, that he would make it right. But the money never came, and neither did he. He had been too ashamed to face what he had done. So he had simply disappeared, burying his past and building a new identity. Years passed. He became successful, then wealthy, then powerful. But no amount of success could erase the guilt that haunted him every single day. He had tried to find Elena many times over the years, but she had moved, changed her name, disappeared into the vast anonymity of the city. He had given up hope of ever knowing what had happened to her, or to the child she had been carrying. Richard looked directly at Maria, his eyes full of tears and desperate hope. He asked her when she was born. She told him, her voice barely a whisper. She was born on March 15th, 31 years ago. Richard closed his eyes and let out a sound that was somewhere between a sob and a laugh. The timing was exactly right. The age was exactly right. And now that he looked at her, really looked at her, he could see Elena in every feature of her face. The dark eyes, the shape of her nose, the way she tilted her head when she was thinking. He said the words that Maria had never expected to hear from anyone. He told her that he believed she was his daughter. The office fell completely silent. Maria stared at the man across from her, the man she had served drinks to just hours ago, the man who had pushed her to play the piano, the man who was now claiming to be her father. She wanted to scream, to run, to deny everything he was saying. But deep down, in a place she had never allowed herself to explore, something told her that he was telling the truth. All her life, she had wondered about her father. Elena had never spoken about him, refusing to answer questions, changing the subject whenever Maria tried to bring it up. Maria had assumed he was dead or gone or simply unimportant. She had built a life without him, never allowing herself to need him. And now here he was, sitting in front of her, one of the richest men in the world. The irony was almost too much to bear. Maria stood up abruptly, knocking over her glass of water. She told Richard that she needed air, that she needed to think, that she could not stay in this room for another second. Before he could respond, she ran to the door and threw it open, disappearing into the hallway. Richard did not follow her. He sat alone in the office, surrounded by his wealth and his success and his crushing guilt. And for the first time in 30 years, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of what he had done. Maria pushed through the swinging doors into the kitchen and leaned against the wall. Her heart was beating too fast, and her hands were trembling. She took a deep breath and tried to calm herself down. It was just a rich old man asking questions. Nothing more. She had dealt with curious guests before. But something about the way Richard Harrington had looked at her made her feel exposed, as if he could see right through her carefully constructed walls. The kitchen was a chaos of steam, shouting and clanging pots. The head chef was screaming at one of the line cooks about a sauce that had been ruined. Waiters rushed in and out, grabbing trays and plates, trying to keep up with the demands of the wealthy guests outside. Nobody paid any attention to Maria as she stood there, trying to compose herself. She had taken this job 3 months ago, not because she wanted it, but because she needed it. The bills had been piling up, and her mother's medical expenses had drained every penny she had saved. Maria had once dreamed of a different life, a life filled with music and applause and standing ovations. But dreams had a way of dying, and hers had been buried long ago. Her mother, Elena, was the only family Maria had ever known. Elena had raised her alone in a small apartment above a bakery in a poor neighborhood. Life had been hard, but there had always been music. Elena had a beautiful voice and used to sing Maria to sleep every night. And when Maria was 5 years old, a kind neighbor had given them an old upright piano that no longer fit in her living room. From that moment on, music had become Maria's entire world. She had shown talent immediately. By the time she was 10, she could play pieces that most adults struggled with. By 15, she was performing at local concerts and winning regional competitions. Teachers told Elena that her daughter was special, that she had a gift that came along once in a generation. They talked about scholarships, conservatories, a career on the international stage. The future had seemed so bright, but then Elena had gotten sick. The diagnosis came just after Maria's 18th birthday, and everything changed. The treatments were expensive, far more expensive than anything they could afford. Maria had tried to continue her studies while caring for her mother, but it was impossible. She had to drop out of the music program. She had to sell the piano to pay for medications. She had to give up everything she had worked for just to keep her mother alive. Now, at 28 years old, Maria worked double shifts at restaurants and hotels, sending every spare dollar to the hospital where her mother was slowly recovering. The doctors said Elena was getting better, but the road ahead was still long. Maria rarely thought about music anymore. It hurt too much to remember what she had lost. She straightened her uniform and picked up a fresh tray of champagne glasses. The gala was for music education of all things. The cruel irony was not lost on her. All these wealthy people throwing money at a cause they did not truly understand, while she served them drinks and smiled like everything was fine. None of them knew what it felt like to have music stolen from your life. Maria walked back into the ballroom and began circulating among the guests. She kept her head down and avoided looking at the piano. She also avoided looking at Richard Harrington, though she could feel his eyes following her around the room. What did he want from her? Why was he so interested in a nobody waitress? An hour passed, and the guests were becoming increasingly impatient. Maria heard them complaining about the missing entertainment. Apparently, the pianist who was supposed to perform had not arrived, and there was talk of the evening being ruined. Some guests were already collecting their coats, ready to leave early. Richard Harrington climbed onto the small stage at the front of the ballroom. He held a microphone and smiled his practiced, charming smile. He apologized for the delay and explained that the scheduled performer had been delayed by weather, but he promised that the entertainment would begin shortly. He asked for the guests' patience for just a few more minutes. Maria watched him from across the room. He was a good public speaker, confident and smooth. But there was something behind his words, something he was not saying. She had learned to read people during her years of service work. It was a survival skill. And right now, Richard Harrington was planning something. He stepped down from the stage and walked directly toward her. Maria felt her stomach tighten. She tried to move away, to disappear into the crowd, but he was too fast. Within moments, he was standing in front of her, blocking her path. Richard spoke quietly, so that only she could hear. He told her that he needed her help. The guests were expecting music, and he had no one to play for them. He had seen the way she looked at the piano. He knew she could play. Would she consider performing, just for a few minutes, just to save the evening? Maria stared at him in disbelief. Was he serious? She was a waitress, not a performer. She had not touched a piano in almost 10 years. She could not possibly play in front of all these important people. The very idea terrified her. She told him no. She said it firmly, without hesitation. She was not qualified, she was not prepared, and she was not interested. Then she tried to walk away, but Richard did not give up so easily. He followed her, still speaking in that low, persuasive voice. He told her that he could see she was carrying a heavy burden. He did not know what it was, but he recognized the look in her eyes. It was the look of someone who had lost something precious. He said that sometimes the only way to heal was to face what we had lost, to embrace it instead of running from it. Maria stopped walking. His words had struck something deep inside her, something she had tried very hard to ignore. She turned to face him, and for the first time, she looked at him not as a wealthy stranger, but as another human being who seemed to understand pain. Richard pressed his advantage. He told her that this charity event was about giving children the gift of music. How could she refuse to share her own gift, even for just a few minutes? How could she let fear stop her from doing something beautiful? Maria felt tears forming in her eyes. She blinked them back angrily. She did not want to cry in front of this man, in front of all these people. But his words had opened a door that she had kept locked for so long. Behind that door were all the memories, all the dreams, all the music that she had forced herself to forget. She looked across the room at the grand piano. It was waiting for her, silent and patient. She remembered what it felt like to sit at the keys, to let her fingers dance across the ivory, to lose herself in the beauty of the music. She remembered the joy, the freedom, the sense of purpose that playing had given her, and she remembered her mother lying in a hospital bed, telling her that music was in her blood and that no amount of suffering could ever take that away. Maria took a deep breath. She turned to Richard Harrington and said one word. She said yes. The moment Maria agreed, everything seemed to move in slow motion. She felt as if she was watching herself from outside her own body, unable to believe what she had just done. 10 years without touching a piano, and now she was about to perform in front of the most powerful and wealthy people in the city. It was madness. Complete and utter madness. Richard's face broke into a smile that seemed genuine, not the practiced political smile he showed to his guests. He took her hand gently and led her toward the stage. Maria's legs felt weak, and she was sure that everyone could see her trembling. The other waiters watched her with confused expressions, wondering why the boss was holding hands with one of the servers. The guests began to notice too, conversations trailing off as people turned to see what was happening. Thomas, Richard's assistant, rushed over with a panicked expression. He whispered urgently to Richard, asking what was going on and warning that this was highly unusual. But Richard waved him away without even looking at him. His attention was completely focused on Maria, as if she was the most important person in the room. They reached the stage, and Richard helped Maria up the small steps. Her black shoes felt too tight, and her server's uniform suddenly seemed ridiculous compared to the elegant gowns around her. She wanted to run, to disappear through the service door, and never look back. But something kept her moving forward. Perhaps it was Richard's steady hand on her arm. Perhaps it was the memory of her mother's voice. Or perhaps it was the piano itself, calling to her after so many years of silence. Richard took the microphone again and addressed the crowd. He explained that while they waited for the scheduled performer, a very special surprise had presented itself. One of their own, a young woman working tonight as a server, had agreed to share her remarkable gift with them. He asked the guests to welcome Maria to the stage. The applause was polite but confused. Who was this waitress? Why was Richard Harrington, of all people, making such a fuss about her? Maria could see the skepticism on their faces, the barely concealed amusement. She was a spectacle to them, a curiosity, nothing more. None of them expected anything impressive. Richard squeezed her shoulder encouragingly and stepped back. Maria walked alone to the piano and sat down on the bench. The leather was cool beneath her, and the keys gleamed under the stage lights. She placed her fingers on the ivory, feeling the familiar texture that she had missed so desperately. For a moment she just sat there, eyes closed. Remembering she remembered being a little girl, barely tall enough to reach the keys. Sitting on a stack of books so she could play the old upright in their tiny apartment. She remembered her mother standing behind her, humming along, hands on Maria's small shoulders. She remembered the hours and hours of practice, the scales and exercises, the pieces that grew more complex with each passing year. She remembered the joy of mastering a difficult passage, the satisfaction of making the music come alive. She also remembered the day she had to sell that piano. The men had come to take it away, and Maria had stood in the empty space where it had been, feeling as if a part of her soul had been ripped out. She had promised herself that day that she would never play again. What was the point? Music had not saved her mother. Music had not paid the bills. Music was a luxury she could no longer afford. But now, sitting at this beautiful Steinway, Maria realized that she had been wrong. Music was not a luxury. It was a necessity as vital as breathing, as essential as love. She had tried to live without it, and she had been slowly dying inside. She could see that now, with a clarity that almost hurt. The ballroom was silent, waiting. Maria opened her eyes and looked down at her hands. They were the hands of a server, rough from carrying heavy trays, scarred from that terrible accident years ago, when a drunk customer had shattered a glass and she had tried to clean it up too quickly. But beneath the roughness, beneath the scars, they were still the hands of a musician. She began to play. The first notes came hesitantly, like a child taking its first steps after a long illness. Maria chose a piece she had learned as a teenager, a nocturne by Chopin that had always been one of her favorites. It was gentle, melancholic, full of longing and beauty. The perfect reflection of everything she was feeling in that moment. At first, her fingers stumbled. A decade of neglect had taken its toll, and the muscle memory that had once been so reliable now felt rusty and uncertain. Maria felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. The guests would be laughing at her, she was sure of it. She was making a fool of herself, but she did not stop. She pushed through the mistakes, through the fear, through the doubt, and slowly something miraculous began to happen. Her fingers began to remember. The music began to flow. The hesitation gave way to confidence, and the stumbles gave way to grace. By the middle of the piece, Maria was no longer in the ballroom. She was somewhere else entirely, a place where there was no pain, no poverty, no sickness, no loss. There was only the music, pure and perfect, filling every corner of her being. She played with her whole heart, pouring 10 years of grief and longing into every note. The guests had stopped talking. They had stopped fidgeting. They sat frozen in their seats, champagne glasses forgotten, mouths slightly open. Even the servers had stopped working, standing still at the edges of the room, trays held motionless in their hands. The music had cast a spell over everyone. Richard Harrington stood at the side of the stage, and tears were streaming down his face. He made no effort to hide them or wipe them away. He simply stood there, watching Maria play and crying like a child. Thomas, standing nearby, had never seen his boss show any emotion at all, and he did not know what to do. Maria finished the nocturne and transitioned seamlessly into another piece, something faster and more passionate. Her confidence was growing with every passing moment. The piano responded to her touch like an old friend, warm and welcoming. She had forgotten how alive she felt when she played, how complete, how real. She did not know how long she played. Time had lost all meaning. But eventually she came to the end of her third piece, a powerful and triumphant work that left her fingers flying across the keys with an energy she did not know she still possessed. The final chord rang out through the ballroom, lingering in the air like a held breath, and then there was silence. For one terrible moment, Maria thought she had failed. She thought the guests were too shocked by her audacity, too offended by her presumption. She began to stand, ready to flee the stage in shame, but then the applause began. It started with one person, then 2, then 10, then the entire ballroom. People were standing up, clapping, shouting, some of them wiping tears from their own eyes. It was a standing ovation, the kind that Maria had dreamed about as a young girl, the kind she had never thought she would receive. Maria stood frozen at the piano, unable to process what was happening. She looked out at the sea of faces, all of them looking at her with admiration and wonder. She looked at Richard Harrington, who was clapping harder than anyone, his cheeks still wet with tears. And she realized that something profound had just occurred. Something had changed, not just in the room, but inside herself. She had found her music again. After all these years, she had found herself. 3 days passed before Maria could bring herself to visit her mother in the hospital. 3 days of sleepless nights, of endless questions, of staring at the folder Richard had given her without being able to open it again. She had called in sick to work, unable to face the hotel where everything had changed. The hospital room was small but comfortable, filled with flowers and cards from well-wishers Maria did not know. Elena lay in the bed by the window, thinner than Maria remembered, but with a peaceful expression on her face. The doctors said she was improving, that the latest treatments were working, that there was hope for a full recovery. Maria had always wondered how they could afford such expensive treatments. Now she knew. Elena opened her eyes as Maria sat down beside her. Her face lit up with the gentle smile that had guided Maria through her entire life. She asked why Maria looked so serious, why there were dark circles under her eyes, why she seemed like she was carrying the weight of the world. Maria took her mother's hand and told her everything. She spoke about the gala, about playing the piano, about Richard Harrington and his confession. She watched Elena's face as she spoke, looking for surprise, for shock, for denial. But instead she saw something that looked like relief. Relief and sadness and love, all mixed together. When Maria finished, Elena was quiet for a long time. She stared out the window at the gray sky, her fingers intertwined with her daughter's. Finally she spoke. And her voice was the same voice that had sung Maria to sleep as a child. Warm and gentle and full of impossible love. Elena told her story. The story she had kept hidden for 31 years. She and Richard had met at a small cafe where she sang on weekend nights. He was young and handsome and impossibly talented at the piano. They had fallen in love almost immediately, drawn together by their shared passion for music and their shared dreams of escaping poverty. For 2 years they had been happy. Despite having nothing but each other, when Elena discovered she was pregnant, she had been overjoyed. She had imagined a family, a home, a life filled with music and laughter. But Richard had reacted differently. She could see the fear in his eyes, the way he pulled back when she tried to touch him. He told her about the job offer, about the opportunity he could not pass up. He promised he would come back, that he would send for her, that they would be together again, but Elena had known, even then, that he was lying. Not because he was a bad person, but because he was terrified. Terrified of failure, of responsibility, of being trapped in a life he was not ready for. She had loved him enough to understand, and she had loved him enough to let him go. Maria interrupted, her voice thick with emotion. She asked why Elena had never told her any of this. Why she had kept Richard's identity a secret all these years, Elena explained. She said that she had not wanted Maria to grow up with anger in her heart. She had not wanted her daughter to spend her life hating a man who had made a terrible mistake when he was too young to know better. Richard's abandonment had hurt more than words could ever express. But Elena had chosen to focus on the good things, on Maria, on music, on building a life from the ruins of her dreams. She had watched Maria grow up with the same talent, the same passion, the same fire that had drawn Elena to Richard in the first place. And every time Maria sat at the piano, Elena saw both the man she had loved and the daughter who had made her life worth living. Maria asked about the money. She asked if Elena had known that Richard was secretly helping them. Elena nodded slowly. She said that she had suspected for years. The bills that mysteriously decreased, the anonymous donations to Maria's music programs, the scholarship that had appeared out of nowhere. She had never been able to prove it, but she had always known that Richard was watching from the shadows. It was his way of apologizing, she supposed. His way of being a father without having to face the consequences of his absence. Maria felt fresh tears falling down her cheeks. She asked her mother if she was angry at Richard, if she hated him for what he had done. Elena smiled sadly and shook her head. She said that she had spent years being angry, years grieving, years wondering what might have been. But anger was exhausting and grief was heavy, and she had eventually chosen to let them go. Not for Richard's sake, but for her own. And for Maria's, she reached up and touched her daughter's face, wiping away the tears. She told Maria that what happened next was her choice. Richard was reaching out, trying to make amends. Maria could reject him, could accept him, could demand more time to decide. Whatever she chose, Elena would support her. But Elena also said something else, something that Maria did not expect. She said that people were capable of change. Richard had been young and foolish 30 years ago, but perhaps he was different now. Perhaps the guilt and the longing had transformed him into someone better. The only way to know for sure was to give him a chance. Maria stayed with her mother for hours, talking and crying and remembering. They spoke about the old piano in their apartment, the one Maria had learned to play on before it was sold. They spoke about the festivals where Elena used to sing, the small crowds that would gather to hear her beautiful voice. They spoke about dreams that had been lost and dreams that might still be possible. When Maria finally left the hospital, the sun was setting over the city. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, and the air was crisp with the promise of change. She walked slowly through the streets, thinking about everything she had learned, everything she felt, everything she needed to decide. She thought about Richard sitting alone in his grand mansion, surrounded by all his wealth and success, but empty of the things that truly mattered. She thought about her mother lying in the hospital bed, having found peace despite all the pain she had endured. And she thought about herself, standing at a crossroads, with the power to shape her own future. By the time she reached her small apartment, Maria had made her decision. She took out her phone and found the business card that Richard had pressed into her hand before she left the gala. She stared at it for a long moment, her thumb hovering over the screen. Then she dialed the number. Maria ran through the halls of the hotel, her server's uniform drawing confused looks from the elegantly dressed guests she passed. She did not care about appearances anymore. She did not care about anything except getting away from that room, away from that man, away from the truth that was threatening to tear her entire world apart. She found a service exit and pushed through it, emerging into the cold night air of the loading dock. Delivery trucks sat empty and silent, and the only light came from a single bulb hanging above the door. Maria leaned against the brick wall and finally allowed herself to cry. The tears came in great, heaving sobs that shook her entire body. She cried for her mother, who had carried this secret for over 30 years. She cried for herself, for all the years she had spent wondering why she was not enough, why her father had never come for her. And she cried for the piano, for the music she had sacrificed, for the life she could have had if everything had been different. How long she stood there she did not know. But eventually the tears slowed, and the cold began to seep through her thin uniform. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and tried to think clearly. Richard Harrington was her father. The more she thought about it, the more sense it made. Her mother had always avoided talking about her past, about the time before Maria was born. There had been a sadness in Elena's eyes whenever music played on the radio, a melancholy that Maria had never understood. Now she knew why. Elena had loved a musician and he had broken her heart, but there was something that did not add up. If Richard had truly wanted to find them, he could have done so. He was one of the most powerful men in the country. He had resources, connections, investigators. He could have tracked down Elena and Maria at any time. But he had not. He had built his empire, hosted his charity galas, and lived his life of luxury while his daughter served drinks for minimum wage and his former love withered away in a hospital bed. The anger came suddenly, fierce and hot. It burned away the tears and the confusion, leaving only a cold, hard fury. Who did Richard Harrington think he was? Did he think he could simply claim her now, after all these years of absence? Did he think a few tears and a heartfelt confession would make up for 3 decades of abandonment? Maria pushed herself off the wall and walked back inside. She had made a decision. She was going to confront him, and she was going to demand answers that he could not avoid. She found Richard still in the private office, exactly where she had left him. He looked older now, smaller, as if the weight of his confession had physically diminished him. When she walked through the door, his face lit up with hope, then fell as he saw the anger in her eyes. Maria stood in front of him and spoke clearly and coldly. She told him that she did not care about his money or his success or his guilt. She told him that he had abandoned her mother when she needed him most, and that his absence had shaped every aspect of their lives. She told him that Elena had worked 3 jobs to support them, that she had sacrificed her voice and her health and her dreams, and that she was now lying in a hospital bed, still waiting for a man who never came. Richard listened without interrupting. Each word was like a blow, and he accepted them all without flinching. When Maria finished, silence filled the room. Then Richard spoke. He did not make excuses or offer justifications. He simply said that she was right. He said that he had been a coward and a fool, and that there was nothing he could do to change the past. But he asked her to give him a chance to make the future different. Maria laughed bitterly. She asked how he could possibly make up for 30 years of nothing. What could he offer now that would erase all the suffering? Richard stood and walked to his desk. He opened a drawer and pulled out a folder, thick with documents. He handed it to Maria and told her to look inside. Maria opened the folder suspiciously. Inside, she found bank statements, legal documents, and photographs. The bank statements showed regular deposits going back nearly 20 years, all to an account she had never heard of. The legal documents established a trust fund in her name, worth millions of dollars. And the photographs were of her, at different ages and in different places, clearly taken from a distance by someone who was watching but never approaching, Richard explained. He said that he had found them 15 years ago, Elena and Maria both. He had hired investigators, tracked down their address, learned everything about their lives. But he had been too afraid to make contact. He was terrified that they would reject him, that Elena would hate him, that Maria would refuse to acknowledge him. So he had watched from afar like a ghost haunting the life he had thrown away. He had set up the trust fund, depositing money every month, hoping that someday he would find the courage to reveal himself. He had paid for Elena's medical treatments anonymously, working through intermediaries so that the source of the money would never be traced. And he had created his music education charity specifically because of Maria, because he had watched her talent blossom and then be cruelly snatched away. When Elena got sick, Maria stared at the documents in disbelief. Her mother's hospital bills, the ones she had been working so hard to pay, the ones that seemed to decrease mysteriously every month despite the expensive treatments. That had been Richard. The scholarship she had almost received to the conservatory before she had to drop out. The one that had been revoked due to a bureaucratic error. That had not been an error at all. Richard had arranged it, hoping to give her a future, only to watch it slip away when Elena's illness became critical. She looked up at him, not knowing what to feel. Anger still burned inside her, but now it was mixed with something else. Confusion, perhaps. Or the first fragile stirrings of understanding. Richard told her that he knew he could not buy forgiveness. He knew that money could not replace the years of absence, the missed birthdays, the empty chair at family dinners. But he wanted her to know that he had never forgotten her. Not for a single day. He had built his entire empire with one purpose in mind, to be able to give her and Elena everything he had failed to give them when it mattered most. Maria closed the folder and set it on the desk. She told Richard that she needed time. She needed to process everything she had learned, to talk to her mother, to figure out what this meant for her life going forward. She could not promise him anything, not forgiveness, not a relationship, not even another conversation. But she would think about it. Richard nodded, accepting her terms. He told her that he would wait as long as it took. He had waited 30 years already. He could wait longer. Maria walked to the door, then stopped. Without turning around, she asked one more question. She asked why he had pushed her to play the piano tonight. Had he known who she was all along? Richard answered honestly. He said that he had not known for certain, not until she told him her mother's name. But he had hoped. From the moment he saw her, something inside him had recognized her. Not her face, not her features, but something deeper. Her spirit, perhaps. The same spirit that had drawn him to Elena all those years ago, Maria stood still for a moment, absorbing his words. Then she opened the door and walked out, leaving Richard alone with his memories and his hopes and his desperate wish that it was not too late to become the father he should have been all along. 1 year later, the same grand ballroom at the Riverside Hotel was filled once again with the city's most powerful people. The crystal chandeliers still cast their rainbow reflections, and the soft music still floated through the air. But this year's charity gala was different. This year there was a headline performer everyone was talking about. Maria stood backstage, dressed not in a server's uniform but in an elegant black gown that Richard had insisted on buying for her. Her hair was styled beautifully, and her hands, though still scarred, were steady and confident. She peered through the curtain at the crowd of wealthy donors, many of whom had been present the night everything changed. Richard appeared beside her, looking healthier and happier than she had ever seen him. In the year since their reunion, he had changed in ways that surprised everyone who knew him. He had become softer, more patient, more interested in the people around him than in his next business deal. His assistant Thomas said it was like working for a completely different person. The first months had been difficult. Maria had agreed to meet with Richard, but she had maintained strict boundaries. Coffee in public places, limited conversation, no promises of any kind. She needed to see if he was sincere, if his remorse was genuine. If he was capable of being the father she had never had. Richard had accepted every condition without complaint. He showed up to every meeting on time, listened more than he spoke, and never pushed for more than Maria was willing to give. He asked questions about her life, her interests, her struggles. He shared stories about his own journey, the mistakes he had made, the lessons he had learned too late. Slowly, carefully, trust began to build between them. Maria started visiting him at his home, a massive mansion that felt cold and lonely despite its grandeur. She played the piano in his music room, the same type of Steinway she had performed on at the gala. Richard would sit nearby, listening with closed eyes and tears that he no longer tried to hide. The real breakthrough came when Richard visited Elena in the hospital. Maria had arranged the meeting after weeks of hesitation, unsure how either of them would react. She watched from the doorway as Richard entered the room, and saw Elena for the first time in 30 years. He fell to his knees beside her bed and wept like a child. He begged for forgiveness, speaking through sobs that shook his entire body. He told Elena that losing her had been the worst mistake of his life, that he had never loved anyone else, that he had spent 30 years building an empire to fill the void she had left. Elena reached out and touched his face, the same gentle touch that had comforted Maria through every hardship. She told him that she had forgiven him long ago. She said that anger was too heavy to carry for a lifetime, and that she had chosen love instead. Not romantic love, but something deeper, the love of a mother for her child. The love of a woman for the man who had given her the greatest gift of all. From that day forward, Richard had devoted himself to making up for lost time. He paid off all of Elena's medical bills openly, no longer hiding behind anonymous donations. He arranged for the best doctors, the most advanced treatments, the most comfortable private room, and he sat with her for hours, talking about the old days, the music they used to make together, the dreams they had once shared. Elena's health improved steadily, a development the doctors called remarkable. Within 6 months she was strong enough to leave the hospital. Richard offered to move her into his mansion where she could have anything she needed. But Elena declined. She wanted to go home, to the small apartment where she had raised Maria, where the memories lived. Richard respected her wishes, but he visited every day. Sometimes he brought flowers. Sometimes he brought groceries. Sometimes he just sat with her, holding her hand, making up for all the years of silence. Maria watched this transformation with amazement and cautious hope. She had never expected her mother and her father to find their way back to each other. But as the months passed, it became clear that something was rekindling between them. Not the passionate love of their youth, but something gentler and perhaps more enduring, companionship, understanding, a second chance at the happiness they had lost. Now, standing backstage at the gala, Maria felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see Elena, looking beautiful in a simple blue dress, her eyes shining with pride. Richard had arranged for her to attend the event, complete with a special chair near the stage where she could watch her daughter perform. Elena told Maria that she was proud of her, that all the years of sacrifice had been worth it just to see this moment. She reminded Maria that music was her birthright, inherited from both her parents, and that nothing could ever take it away again. Richard joined them, standing between the two women who meant more to him than all his money and power combined. He looked at Maria and told her that this was her night, that the crowd was waiting, that it was time to show the world what she was capable of. Maria hugged her parents, drawing strength from their presence. Then she walked through the curtain and onto the stage. The crowd erupted in applause the moment she appeared. Word had spread about the waitress who had stunned everyone with her performance the previous year. People had been waiting months to hear her play again. Tickets to this year's gala had sold out within hours, raising more money for music education than any previous event. Maria sat at the piano and looked out at the audience. She saw wealthy businessmen and famous celebrities. She saw politicians and philanthropists. But most importantly, she saw her mother and father, sitting together in the front row, holding hands. She began to play. The music that filled the ballroom was different from what she had played before. Last year, she had performed with desperation, with grief, with the pain of lost dreams. This year, she played with joy, with gratitude, with the knowledge that her life had taken an impossible turn, and that the future was brighter than she had ever imagined. She played for her mother, who had sacrificed everything so that Maria could have a chance. She played for her father, who had spent 30 years trying to find his way back. And she played for herself, for the little girl who had once sat on a stack of books to reach the keys, dreaming of a moment exactly like this one. When the final note faded, the ballroom was silent for a heartbeat. Then the crowd rose as one, applauding with a passion that shook the chandeliers. Richard and Elena stood with them, tears streaming down their faces, their hearts full of a love that had survived 3 decades of separation. Maria stood and bowed, accepting the applause with grace and humility. She had found her music again. She had found her father. And most importantly, she had found the strength to forgive, to heal, and to embrace the family she had always deserved. As she looked at her parents standing together, Maria knew that the story was not ending. It was just beginning. And whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, united by music and bound by a love that had never truly died. The shocking truth that had emerged that fateful night at the gala had not destroyed her. It had set her free.